People say money can't carry a goodbye. But on my 60th birthday, my husband leaned into my ear and handed me $36 million, like it was a secret he didn't expect to survive. The room was loud with laughter, glasses touching, music soft enough to sound like peace. But Calder wasn't celebrating. His hand trembled against mine, warm but urgent, and when he whispered, "I moved everything into your account, just to be safe," it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a warning. I kept my smile because the whole house was watching me in that sweet, hungry way. People watch a birthday woman, waiting for her to glow, waiting for her to cry, waiting for her to say something thankful and pretty. The cake sat on the table like a crown, candles already planted, and the air smelled like perfume and roasted meat, and the kind of money that makes people behave. Calder stood close enough that anyone would have assumed we were just being romantic, his cheek brushing mine, his voice low, private, husband soft, but his eyes weren't soft. His eyes were working. They kept sliding past my shoulder to the living room, to the doorway, to the hallway that led toward the garage, then back to the crowd like he was counting exits. I felt it in my bones before I could name it. The way you feel a storm coming even when the sky still looks polite. "Calder," I murmured without moving my lips too much. "Why would you do that today?" He didn't answer right away. He pressed my hand once, hard like a signal. "Just to be safe," he repeated, slower this time, and as if the words had weight and he needed me to carry them carefully. A burst of laughter rose behind us. Someone clapped to start a birthday song rehearsal. A cousin I hadn't seen in years raised a phone to record. Calder didn't look at any of it. His gaze landed on Riven and Lyra near the bar cart, where the expensive glasses glittered like jewelry. Riven had his arm around Lyra's waist, the way young couples do when they want the world to understand they belong to each other. They looked good together, clean, smiling, the kind of picture people frame. But Calder's eyes tightened when they laughed, and the laugh didn't reach his mouth. He didn't frown either. That's what made it worse. He wore the same calm face he wore in boardrooms, the one that didn't give people anything to grab onto. "Is something wrong?" I said, still smiling, and still playing birthday lady. My throat felt dry all of a sudden, like my body had decided to brace itself without permission. Calder's thumb stroked the back of my hand once, gentle, almost tender, and then it stopped. "Not tonight," he said. "Not here." He shifted slightly so his body blocked mine from the room, just a little, like he was shielding me from something that didn't have a shape yet. When someone called his name across the room, he didn't answer. When Lyra waved, he lifted 2 fingers and dropped them again. He looked past her, not at her. I watched Riven in that moment, the way his smile held, the way his eyes flicked away too fast when Calder looked his direction. I didn't know what it meant. I only knew it wasn't nothing. Calder leaned back in, close enough that his breath warmed my ear. "Listen to me," he said. And then for the first time that night, his voice cracked on the edge of fear. "Whatever happens, you don't sign anything. You don't agree to anything. You don't let anybody rush you." His words landed in my chest like cold stones. It wasn't the kind of thing a man says during a birthday toast. It wasn't even the kind of thing a man says to his wife unless he believes time is about to turn on him. I swallowed, and my smile started to ache. "Calder, stop," I whispered, because I could feel people watching us now, reading meaning into the way he hovered. "You're scaring me." He didn't apologize. He didn't soothe it away with a joke. He only looked at me the way a man looks at a locked door when he hears footsteps on the other side. "I'd rather you be scared than unprepared," he said. Then he stepped away like he'd said too much, and the room rushed back into place. The music, the chatter, the clinking glasses, the bright faces. Halfway through the night, when I finally had a quiet second, I looked at my phone and saw the bank alert sitting there, like proof that the whisper was real. numbers that didn't feel like mine. A transfer so large my hands went cold holding the screen. If you've ever had a moment where joy and dread sat in the same chair inside you, you know that feeling. And if you've felt it before, say so in the comments, because women like us don't make these instincts up. I found Calder near the front door close to midnight, coat already in his hand, though the party wasn't over. "You're leaving?" I asked softly. He looked at me for a long second, the way people look when they want to memorize a face. "I'll be back," he said. But it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like hope. He kissed my forehead, not my mouth, like I was something he needed to protect more than he needed to hold. "Get some rest," he told me. "Tomorrow is just another day." Then he paused, his eyes cutting once more across the room to where Riven and Lyra stood, and his jaw set like a lock turning. "And Mara," he added so low only I could hear it, "keep your phone on." 24 hours later, I was standing in my bedroom in my robe, staring at the sunlight on the curtains, when my phone rang and a stranger's voice said my husband's name like it belonged to a report, not a life, and the next word stripped the air out of my lungs. "Ma'am, there's been an accident on the highway. Your husband didn't make it." The morning after Calder's funeral, the house felt heavier than silence. Flowers lined the hallway like quiet witnesses, their perfume turning sweet and stale in the warm air. I had just finished folding the black shawl I wore to the service when the doorbell rang. Sharp, precise, not the hesitant press of someone offering comfort. For a moment, I thought it might be another neighbor bringing condolences, another soft voice telling me to stay strong. I opened the door, expecting sympathy. Instead, Riven stood there in a perfectly tailored suit, Lyra at his side, and a man I had never seen before holding a leather folder like a shield. "Mara," Riven said, his voice smooth, careful, almost rehearsed. He didn't call me Mom. He hadn't in months, but hearing my name alone felt colder now that Calder was gone. Lyra smiled politely, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. When the man beside them stepped forward slightly, introducing himself as a legal representative before I even invited them in, that was the first moment something inside me tightened. Grief pushed aside by instinct. People who come to comfort don't bring lawyers. They moved into the living room without waiting for me to offer coffee or condolences. Lyra's gaze traveled across the framed photographs on the wall, Calder laughing, family holidays, birthdays from years when everything still felt simple, and she barely paused at any of them. Riven remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, posture stiff like he was waiting for a meeting to begin rather than sitting in the home where he had grown up. "I know this is a difficult time," the lawyer began, voice calm, measured, "but there are urgent financial matters that need to be addressed." Urgent. The word echoed too loudly in a house that still held Calder's last breath in its corners. Riven finally sat down across from me, his knee bouncing once before he stilled it. He looked older than I remembered, not from grief, but from distance. Like someone who had already stepped outside the circle of family and was now observing it from somewhere safer. "Dad made some decisions before he passed," he said, glancing at the lawyer. "Decisions that may not reflect his true intentions." Lyra nodded quickly, her fingers tightening around her phone. She didn't look at me directly. Instead, she watched the lawyer as if waiting for permission to speak. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my voice even. Young Calder knew exactly what he was doing. The lawyer slid a document from the folder, placing it gently on the table between us. "We believe the transfer made on your birthday may have been done under emotional strain," he explained. "Given the size of the estate, it would be appropriate to review the legitimacy of that decision." Review the legitimacy. Such soft words for something that sounded like erasing a promise. Riven leaned forward slightly, his tone lowering. "It's not personal, Mara. We just want things to be fair." Fair. The word landed wrong. I remembered the boy who used to bring me flowers from the yard, the teenager who once hugged me so tightly after losing a school game that I thought my ribs might crack. That boy would have sat beside me now, not across from me with a stranger holding papers. "Now, you came here with a lawyer the day after your father was buried," I said quietly. "Tell me how that feels fair." Lyra finally met my eyes, her expression calm but distant. "We're trying to protect what's his," she said. The way she said his made it sound like I had never truly belonged. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Our concern is simply that the transfer be reconsidered. There are steps that can be taken to reverse it until the estate is properly settled." Reverse it. The room seemed to tilt slightly as those words settled into the air. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires crunching over gravel, the ordinary sound of life continuing while mine shifted under my feet. Riven stood, smoothing his jacket like the conversation was already decided. "We're not asking for a fight," he said, though his eyes held none of the warmth I used to recognize. "We just need you to cooperate." I watched him carefully, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way Lyra stayed half a step behind him, the lawyer's calm patience, and realized this moment had been planned long before Calder's funeral ended, maybe long before his death. "And if I don't?" I asked softly. The lawyer didn't answer. Riven did. He lifted the document slightly, his voice steady, almost detached. "Then we'll have to pursue legal action to reverse the transfer." He paused, letting the words hang between us like a blade. "Because what Dad moved into your account doesn't belong there." The room went still, and for the first time since Calder's accident, grief stepped aside to make room for something sharper. A quiet, rising understanding that this wasn't just mourning anymore. It was a battle I hadn't agreed to fight. Riven turned toward the door as if the conversation was finished, Lyra following without hesitation. The lawyer gathered his papers slowly, leaving one copy on the table like a challenge. Just before stepping out, Riven looked back at me, his expression unreadable. "We expect your decision soon," he said, "because that transfer has to be reversed." The house stayed quiet long after Riven and Lyra left, but their words didn't leave with them. I sat at the dining table where Calder used to read the morning reports, staring at the copy of the document they'd left behind. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried years I hadn't noticed slipping away. For the first time since the accident, and I stopped thinking about lawyers and transfers and started thinking about Riven. Not the man who stood in my living room with rehearsed coldness, but the boy who once refused to go to sleep unless I checked the closet for monsters. There was a photograph on the shelf behind me, taken years ago at a beach we used to visit every summer. Riven was younger there, laughing with sand stuck to his knees, his arm wrapped around my shoulder, as if I belonged exactly where I stood. He used to call me Mom without hesitation, even when people reminded him I wasn't the one who gave birth to him. Calder would smile quietly when he heard it, never correcting him. Back then, affection wasn't something he measured or withheld. The shift didn't happen overnight. It arrived slowly, like a draft through a closed window. First, the calls grew shorter. Then the visits became formal, always scheduled, always ending early. After he married Lyra, the warmth that used to fill a room when he walked in felt replaced by something careful, polite, but distant. I remember the first time he called me Mara instead of Mom. It was during a dinner at a restaurant, said casually, almost by accident. Lyra laughed softly at something unrelated, but the sound stayed with me longer than the words themselves. I tried to tell myself it was normal. Sons grow up, families change. But now, sitting alone in the house Calder built, those moments lined up differently in my memory. Not random, not harmless, intentional. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me back from the quiet spiral of thoughts. A message notification lit up the screen, not from Riven, but from the family plan Calder had set up years ago. And I hadn't checked the shared account logs since the funeral, but something pushed me to open them now. Call histories stretched across the months, unfamiliar numbers appearing again and again beside Riven's name. Long calls late at night, short calls during business hours. One number repeated more than the others, saved without a name. I stared at it for a long time, the unease settling deeper into my chest. I remembered a woman standing across the street weeks before Calder's birthday party, watching the house longer than a stranger normally would. At the time, I thought she was just another passerby. Now the memory sharpened. She had looked toward Riven's car when it pulled into the driveway, her expression too familiar for coincidence. I clicked into older logs. The pattern went back months, maybe longer. And whoever that number belonged to had become a quiet constant in Riven's life, right around the time his voice started losing its warmth whenever he spoke to me. Lyra's social media popped into my mind, too. The photos she stopped tagging me in, the subtle captions about loyalty and truth that felt pointed even when no names were mentioned. I used to dismiss those things as youthful drama. Now they felt like breadcrumbs leading somewhere darker. I rose from the chair and walked toward the window, watching the empty driveway where Calder used to park. The silence pressed against me differently now. Not just grief, but realization. Relationships don't fracture without pressure. Something, or someone, had been pulling at the seams long before Calder's accident. The sound of Riven's voice from earlier echoed in my mind, cold and rehearsed. They layered over the memory of a boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and called me Mom without thinking twice. Those two versions of him didn't feel like the same person anymore, and that difference didn't begin with a lawyer at my door. My gaze fell back to the phone screen, to that repeated number without a name. A quiet understanding settled into me, the kind that arrives slowly but refuses to leave once it does. Someone had been whispering into my stepson's ear long before Calder whispered into mine. I closed my eyes briefly, the truth forming without needing to be spoken out loud. Whatever had broken between us didn't start with money, or the transfer, or even Calder's death. It started long before, when someone poisoned the relationship before anyone thought to look for the damage. The call came just after noon, when the house felt too still to be called peaceful. I'd been sorting through sympathy cards at the kitchen table, reading names that blurred together into a soft ache, when my phone vibrated against the wood. The number wasn't saved, but something in me answered before the second ring. Mara? The man's voice was calm, professional, carrying the careful weight of someone who knew he was stepping into grief. This is Dr. Soren, a friend of Calder's. I straightened without realizing it. Calder had mentioned Soren before, a physician he trusted, someone he spoke to outside of hospitals and appointments. Yes, I said quietly. How can I help you? There was a pause on the other end, not long but deliberate. I'm calling because there's something you should know, he said. Calder brought me a bottle of wine a few weeks ago, or he asked me to test it privately. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Test it for what? For contamination, he replied. The word felt too clinical for the way my heart dropped. He told me he felt unwell after a small sip. He didn't want to alarm anyone, so he asked me to keep it discreet. I stood slowly, the chair scraping softly behind me. Calder hadn't said a word about feeling sick. He hadn't mentioned testing anything. I remembered that night vaguely. Him setting a wine bottle aside, saying he wasn't in the mood. At the time, I thought it was stress. Now, the memory felt heavier. And, I asked, though something inside me already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. Dr. Soren exhaled softly. The wine tested positive for a toxic substance, he said. Not enough to cause immediate death with one sip, but enough to make someone seriously ill over time. The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly. I pressed my free hand against the counter to steady myself. Poison? The word felt unreal leaving my mouth. "Yes," he said gently. "Calder insisted I keep the findings confidential. He said he needed time to handle things quietly. I didn't know about the accident until yesterday, and I felt you deserved to know." Silence filled the space between us, thick and heavy. I tried to picture Calder sitting across from this man, holding a glass he suspected was dangerous, choosing not to tell me, not to worry me, not to start a war he wasn't ready to fight. "Did he say who gave him the bottle?" I asked. "No names," Dr. Soren replied. "He only said it was a gift." A gift. My mind moved back through recent weeks. The birthday party, the bar cart, the laughter around polished glasses. Riven had brought a special bottle days before, proud of the label, telling Calder it was rare. I remembered how Calder smiled politely, but never opened it in front of anyone. "I think you should speak with the authorities," Dr. Soren added carefully. "If Calder feared something was wrong, it changes how his death should be viewed." I thanked him quietly and ended the call, the phone slipping from my hand onto the counter with a soft thud. The house felt different now. Not just empty, but watchful. Calder hadn't transferred everything into my account out of impulse. He had known something was coming. He had been preparing. I walked slowly into the living room, my gaze falling on the framed photograph from my birthday night. Calder standing beside me, one hand resting lightly at my back, his smile small and guarded. I used to think he was just tired. Now I saw a man measuring danger in a room full of people who thought they were celebrating. The realization settled deep in my chest. He had carried fear alone. He had tested the wine, made legal changes, watched quietly, and still drove his car the next day. I reached for my phone again, staring at the blank screen as if it might offer answers. If Calder suspected poison, if he believed someone wanted to harm him, then the accident on the highway didn't feel random anymore. It felt like the next move in a story he had already begun to understand. Outside, a car engine passed slowly along the street, the sound fading into distance. I closed my eyes, letting the pieces arrange themselves into a question that refused to stay silent. And if he feared poison enough to test a gift in secret, was the crash that killed him really an accident? The house had finally grown quiet enough for memory to speak clearly. After Dr. Soren's call, sleep stopped coming easily, and I found myself walking the halls long after midnight, replaying my birthday in slow, careful pieces. Grief used to blur the edges of that night, but now every detail felt sharper. The laughter, the music, the way Calder kept drifting toward the hallway that led to the garage. I stood in front of the security console near the kitchen, the small screen glowing faintly in the dim light. Calder had installed cameras years ago, mostly for business reasons, but he insisted they stay discreet. No obvious lenses, nothing that made guests uncomfortable. I had never paid much attention to the footage before. Now, my hands hesitated above the controls, like I was opening a door I couldn't close again. The timeline from that evening unfolded in silent images. Guests arrived in clusters, hugging me, placing gifts on the table, smiling wide enough to look genuine. I watched myself moving through the room, shaking hands, laughing, unaware of the tension humming quietly beneath the surface. Calder appeared in frame often, not still, never relaxed, circling the edges of conversations, watching more than he spoke. As I scrubbed through the footage, something small caught my attention. Lyra appeared near the back hallway, smiling brightly as she redirected two guests toward the living room. She placed a gentle hand on one woman's shoulder, laughing as if she were just guiding traffic. At first, it seemed harmless. The kind of thing a gracious daughter-in-law would do during a crowded gathering. But it didn't happen once. It happened again minutes later. Different guests, same hallway, same gentle redirection away from the garage entrance. I leaned closer to the screen, My heart beat steady but heavy. Lyra's movements were smooth, almost rehearsed, always arriving at the right moment to keep people away from that side of the house. No one resisted. Why would they? She smiled too easily for anyone to question her intentions. I rewound the footage, watching again, then again. The pattern felt deliberate. I wasn't accusing anyone, not yet, but suspicion has a way of growing quietly, like a shadow stretching longer as the sun lowers. Calder's uneasy glances during the party suddenly made sense, and he had been watching something I hadn't noticed. The footage shifted to a later hour, the room more crowded, voices louder, glasses lifted higher. I saw myself blowing out the candles, Calder standing just behind me, his expression soft for a moment before it hardened again as he glanced toward the hallway. Riven and Lyra stood near the bar cart, close together, whispering between smiles. Nothing in their body language looked openly wrong. That was the unsettling part. Everything appeared normal enough to dismiss. I advanced the recording slowly, breath held without realizing it. Timestamps flickered across the screen, minutes sliding past unnoticed by anyone living them in real time. Then the camera angle near the side door shifted, catching movement at the edge of the frame. Riven. He walked quickly toward the garage hallway, with head slightly lowered, hands tucked into his pockets. No drink in his hand, no guest beside him, just a purposeful stride that felt out of place compared to the casual flow of the party. He paused briefly, glancing over his shoulder, and for a split second, his face looked tense. Not angry, not sad. Focused. The timestamp told me it was the exact moment Lyra had been guiding another group of guests back toward the living room. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. The pieces were beginning to align, not into accusations, but into questions that refused to stay quiet. I let the footage continue. Riven disappeared into the shadowed hallway leading to the garage, the camera losing him as he moved out of view. No one followed. No one seemed to notice he was gone. I sat back slowly, the room around me suddenly colder. Calder had watched that hallway all night. Lyra had kept people away from it. And now the screen in front of me showed Riven walking toward the place where Calder's car had been parked. Alone. The timestamp blinked quietly at the corner of the screen, holding its breath with me as the realization settled deeper than any spoken accusation. Because for the first time since the accident, I wasn't just remembering the party anymore. I was watching it. And the footage showed Riven near Calder's car. The office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of quiet that belongs to rooms where decisions outlive the people who make them. I sat across from Calder's longtime attorney, a man named Halden, whose calm presence felt steady without trying too hard. He didn't offer condolences the way others had. Instead, he slid a thick folder across the polished desk and rested his hands on top of it, as if measuring the weight of what he was about to reveal. "Calder met with me 3 weeks before your birthday," he said gently, privately. The words settled slowly. 3 weeks. That was before the party, before the transfer, before the accident. I thought about Calder moving through the house during that time. Quiet, watchful, distracted in ways I had mistaken for work stress. "What did he want?" I asked, my voice steady even as my chest tightened. Halden opened the folder, revealing neatly tabbed documents layered with signatures I recognized instantly. Calder's handwriting had always been firm, deliberate, the strokes of someone who didn't sign anything lightly. He restructured operational control of his holdings, Halden explained. Business authority, investment oversight, voting rights, all reassigned to you. I blinked, unsure I had heard correctly. "To me? Before my birthday?" "Yes," he replied. "The transfer you received that night wasn't spontaneous. It was the final step in a process he had already begun." I leaned back slightly, the chair cool against my spine. Calder had never discussed shifting control like this, not in detail. We shared a life, but he often kept business decisions compartmentalized, believing he was protecting me from unnecessary stress. Now the silence around those weeks felt heavier, intentional. "Why?" I asked quietly. Halden hesitated, choosing his words with care. "He said he anticipated complications," he answered. "He didn't specify threats, but he was clear that he wanted you positioned to act without interference if anything happened to him." The memory of Calder whispering in my ear at the party rose sharply. Just to be safe. I felt the echo of his hand squeezing mine, the urgency I had dismissed as nerves. Halden turned another page, revealing a timeline of documents signed and notarized, each date aligned with moments I remembered. Evenings when Calder came home later than usual, mornings when he lingered over coffee without speaking. None of it had felt dramatic at the time. Now every detail formed a pattern. He also adjusted governance structures, Halden continued. Board access, financial approvals, estate oversight. He moved quickly, but everything was legally precise. I stared at the pages, the legal language dense but unmistakable. And Calder hadn't been acting on impulse. He'd been preparing quietly, methodically, while the rest of us lived inside a version of normal that no longer existed. Outside the office window, traffic moved slowly through the afternoon light. Ordinary life continuing while mine shifted again beneath my feet. I thought of Riven standing in my living room with a lawyer, demanding reversals, speaking as though Calder's decisions had been mistakes. The contrast between that moment and these documents felt stark. "Did he say he was in danger?" I asked. Halden shook his head. "Not directly," he said, but he used a phrase I remember clearly. He said, "If something happens, she needs to have the authority no one can question." The room went still around me. He slid one final document toward me, thinner than the others, but marked with a discreet red tab. "There's a clause here most people would overlook," he said quietly. He insisted it remain confidential until after his death. I traced the edge of the paper without opening it yet, sensing its significance before reading a single word. "What does it do?" I asked. Halden met my gaze, his expression respectful but firm. "It gives you discretionary control over certain family assets, authority that cannot be challenged by heirs without triggering automatic restrictions on their access." The words settled slowly, like a door closing somewhere far away. Calder hadn't just protected me. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps even betrayal, and built something into the structure that shifted power in ways no one else expected. I opened the document carefully, eyes scanning the language that felt both precise and deeply personal. As the meaning unfolded, a quiet understanding took root. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about control. And for the first time since Riven arrived with his lawyer, I realized Calder had left me with something far stronger than money, a hidden clause that gave me unexpected power over every asset tied to his name. The police station smelled faintly of coffee and paperwork, a quiet hum of conversations filling the background like distant static. I sat across from Detective Hale, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the folder from Halden resting against my knee. For days, grief had moved through me like a slow tide, heavy but directionless. Now it felt different, focused. Calder's transfer, the poisoned wine, the footage from the birthday night. None of it felt like coincidence anymore. Detective Hale listened without interruption as I explained everything. Dr. Soren's findings, Calder's legal preparations, the strange movements captured by the security cameras. He didn't react dramatically. Instead, he wrote notes with careful precision, nodding occasionally as if each piece confirmed a suspicion he had already begun to form. "We reopened the case this morning," he said finally, sliding a photograph across the table. It was Calder's car, twisted metal caught under harsh daylight. I had avoided looking at images like this since the accident, but now I forced myself to study it. A mechanic's report sat beneath the photo, highlighted sections marking technical language I barely understood. "What am I looking at?" I asked quietly. "Brake system interference," Hale replied. "Not wear and tear, not a manufacturing fault. Someone tampered with it intentionally." The words landed like cold air against my skin. I remembered Calder leaving the party early, his coat slung over his arm, his voice low when he told me to keep my phone on. He had known something was wrong, but he still drove that car the next day. "Can you prove who did it?" I asked. "Not yet," Hale said, "but we're building a timeline." He turned the monitor slightly toward me. Security footage played silently. The same hallway I had watched at home, the same moment where Revan moved toward the garage while Lyra kept guests occupied elsewhere. Seeing it here, framed by official attention, made the unease settle into something heavier. "We're not making accusations," Hale continued, his tone steady. But this changes the nature of Calder's death. It's no longer being treated as an accident." I nodded slowly, feeling a quiet shift inside me. The woman who sat at this table a week ago would have cried, would have asked why, would have clung to hope that everything was a misunderstanding. Now my thoughts moved differently. Not softer, not colder, just clearer. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Hale paused, studying me for a moment before answering. "Cooperation," he said, "and patience. These investigations move carefully." I left the station carrying copies of reports that turned grief into language, timelines, mechanical findings, witness statements. The weight of the folder felt strange against my arm. For the first time since Calder's death, I wasn't just remembering him. I was defending him. At home, the afternoon light stretched across the living room floor, touching the edges of the photographs still lined along the walls. I placed the folder on the table and sat quietly, letting the silence settle around me. My chest still ached when I thought of Calder's voice, but something else had begun to grow beneath the sorrow, a quiet resolve. The phone rang just as I reached for a glass of water. Detective Hale's name appeared on the screen. "We've completed preliminary analysis," he said when I answered. His voice sounded different now, less cautious, more certain. The brake tampering wasn't random. It required planning and access. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the words. "And now?" A pause stretched across the line before he spoke again. "We're preparing arrest warrants," he said. The room felt smaller suddenly, or the air sharper. I thought of Riven standing in my doorway with a lawyer, of Lyra's calm smile during the party, of Calder watching them with quiet tension. "When will it happen?" I asked softly. "Soon," Hale replied, "once the final paperwork clears." The call ended, leaving the house wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than before. I stood by the window, watching the empty driveway where Calder's car used to rest, the evening sun catching the edges of the pavement. Grief hadn't left me. It never would. But something inside me had shifted, from waiting for answers to standing ready for whatever came next, because somewhere beyond this quiet moment, papers were being signed, doors were about to open, and the next chapter of this story wasn't going to be written by sorrow alone. Arrest warrants were already being prepared, and the morning felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that settles over a neighborhood before something changes it forever. I stood near the window with a cup of tea cooling untouched in my hands when the sound of distant sirens rolled softly through the street. It wasn't loud enough to draw attention from most houses, but I knew before my phone rang that something had shifted. Detective Hale's voice came through steady and direct. "Mara, the warrants have been executed," he said. "Riven and Lyra are in custody." The words hung in the air longer than the sound of the sirens outside. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of shock. That feeling had passed days ago, but out of recognition that a line had been crossed. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was action. I stepped onto the porch, the morning sun warm against my shoulders. 2 houses down, neighbors gathered near their gates, whispering quietly as unmarked vehicles pulled away from the curb. The news traveled fast in a community like ours. Curtains shifted, doors opened halfway, and faces turned toward my house with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Riven had grown up on this street. People remembered him as the boy who rode his bicycle in circles until sunset, the teenager who carried groceries for elderly neighbors without being asked. Seeing police escort him into a car would fracture that image for everyone watching. And Lyra, always polished, always composed, now stood beside him with her wrists held carefully, her expression calm but distant. I didn't go closer. I didn't shout or demand explanations. I stayed where I was, hands resting lightly against the porch rail, watching the moment unfold like a chapter I had already begun to understand. A neighbor approached slowly, her voice lowered. "Mara, is it true?" she asked, her eyes searching my face for a reaction she could interpret. I nodded once, not offering details. Words felt unnecessary. And the truth would come out in its own time, through courts and reports and conversations whispered behind closed doors. Across the street, someone lifted a phone to record, the glow of the screen catching the sunlight. Another person shook their head, disbelief etched into their features. The community's reaction moved like a wave, shock, sympathy, quiet judgment. But none of it reached me the way it might have weeks ago. Calder's absence had already changed me. I wasn't here to perform grief or anger. I was here to witness the consequence of choices that had long been hidden beneath polite smiles. Riven glanced toward my house as officers guided him into the back seat of a car. For a brief second, our eyes met across the distance. There was something there. Not apology, not defiance, just a flicker of confusion. Like he had stepped into a reality he hadn't fully believed would come. Lyra kept her gaze forward, her posture straight, her expression carefully controlled. She looked less like a criminal and more like someone stepping into a meeting she intended to manage. That composure unsettled me more than anger would have. The cars pulled away slowly, leaving behind a quiet hum of conversations that drifted through the street long after they disappeared from view. I returned inside, closing the door gently behind me. The house felt calmer than it had in days, as if a tension that once lived in the walls had finally moved outward. My phone buzzed again. Detective Hale. "They're cooperating," he said. "But the investigation isn't finished. As we've gone deeper into the case, we've uncovered information connected to someone named Vera." The name landed softly but heavily. "Who is she?" I asked, though part of me already sensed the answer. "A woman tied to Riven's past," Hale replied carefully. "Her involvement may explain more than we originally thought, not just about the accident, but about family history itself." I stood still, the room suddenly feeling smaller as the weight of those words settled around me. The arrest had already fractured the family name. Now something deeper was beginning to surface. Something older than the night of my birthday, older than the poisoned wine, older even than Calder's final whisper. Because the investigators had just uncovered a piece of history tied to Vera, and it threatened to change everything I thought I understood about our family. Warm of the rain started sometime before dawn, a steady rhythm against the windows that made the house feel smaller than usual. I sat at the kitchen table with Detective Hale's notes spread carefully in front of me, reading through messages that felt less like conversations and more like seeds planted quietly over time. Vera's name appeared again and again, not loudly, not aggressively, but consistently, like a whisper that refused to fade. Hale had warned me before sending the files. "Some of this may be difficult to read," he said. He was right. The messages were short, almost gentle in tone, Vera rarely spoke directly about me or Calder in harsh words. Instead, she framed everything like concern, like a mother guiding her son toward what she called truth. He took everything from me. You deserve what's yours. And don't let anyone erase your real family. Each sentence carried just enough emotion to sound believable, especially to someone already searching for answers. I could see how Riven might have listened. Vera never pushed openly. She suggested, hinted, allowed doubt to grow naturally. The manipulation wasn't loud. It was patient. One message stopped me completely. "Your father isn't who you think he is," she wrote. "One day you'll understand why I stayed away." The timestamp showed it was sent months before Calder's birthday party. Around the same time, Riven's tone toward me began to change. I remembered dinners where he spoke less, calls that ended quickly, conversations that felt rehearsed instead of warm. At the time, I blamed distance, adulthood, marriage. Now I saw the pattern differently. Detective Hale arrived mid-morning, beyond shaking rain from his coat as he stepped inside. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he placed another folder on the table, his expression more serious than usual. "We've confirmed Vera's involvement in influencing Riven," he said. "Phone records, financial traces, travel logs. She re-entered his life quietly and stayed out of public view." "Where is she now?" I asked. "That's the problem," he replied. "She vanished 2 days ago." The words settled heavily in the room. I thought about the woman I barely knew, the shadow who watched from a distance, who fed stories that turned affection into suspicion. Her absence felt intentional, like someone stepping away from a fire before the smoke revealed where it started. Neighbors had mentioned seeing a car parked down the street weeks before the birthday party. A woman sitting inside longer than anyone considered normal. At the time, it felt like coincidence. Now it felt like surveillance. Hale opened the folder, revealing photographs taken from nearby cameras. A figure matching Vera's description appeared briefly near a cafe, then again outside a small apartment complex across town. Each image ended the same way: a blur, a disappearance, a trail that went cold just when it mattered most. "She knew the arrests were coming," Hale said quietly. "We believe she left intentionally to avoid questioning." I stared at the images, trying to imagine the conversations she had with Riven, the slow erosion of trust she must have built, the careful shaping of resentment. It wasn't just about money. Now it was about rewriting history until the truth no longer felt certain. "What else did you find?" I asked. Hale hesitated, then slid a sealed envelope across the table. The paper looked older than the rest of the files, edges worn, the seal marked with an official insignia. "This came up during the investigation," he said. "It's a paternity file, sealed years ago under legal protection." The room grew quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the glass. My fingers hovered over the envelope without opening it, sensing that whatever lay inside would change more than just my understanding of Vera. Hale watched me carefully. "We're still verifying the contents," he added, "but it connects directly to Calder, Vera, and Riven." I exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest. The manipulation, the lies, and the sudden disappearance. All of it pointed towards something deeper than revenge or inheritance, something buried long before my birthday night. The envelope rested between us like a truth waiting for the right moment to be spoken, because detectives had just uncovered a sealed paternity file, and whatever it contained threatened to rewrite the foundation of our entire family. The envelope stayed on the table longer than I expected. Detective Hale didn't rush me. He sat across from me quietly, giving the moment the space it deserved, as if he understood that some truths don't arrive as shock. They arrive as weight. I finally broke the seal. Inside were documents older than my marriage to Calder. Legal filings, medical records, and a court statement written in language that felt distant but painfully clear. My eyes moved slowly across the pages until one sentence stopped me completely. Calder is not the biological father of Riven. The words didn't make a sound, but they shifted everything. I leaned back slightly, breath leaving me in a quiet exhale. Memories rearranged themselves without warning. The way Calder never spoke about Riven's early childhood in detail, the way he avoided conversations about Vera whenever they drifted too close to the past. I had always assumed it was simply pain from a difficult marriage. Now I saw it differently. "When did he find out?" I asked softly. Hale glanced at the document. "Years ago," he said. According to this, Calder discovered the truth during a legal dispute with his first wife. The records suggest an affair involving someone close to him. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the implication. He's someone close. The room felt heavier, quieter, like it was holding its breath with me. "He stayed anyway?" I asked. "Yes," Hale replied. "He chose to raise Riven as his own. The file was sealed to protect the child's identity and prevent public exposure." I looked back down at the pages, tracing Calder's signature at the bottom of one of the documents. It wasn't shaky or reluctant. It was firm. The handwriting of a man making a decision he intended to live with. He hadn't walked away. He hadn't punished a child for an adult's betrayal. He had carried the truth alone. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Riven at 16, sitting at the kitchen counter after a difficult day at school, telling Calder he didn't feel like he belonged anywhere. Calder had placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You belong here." At the time, and I thought it was just a father comforting his son. Now it felt like a promise built on sacrifice. "Vera knew," I said quietly, more to myself than to Hale. "She must have known." Hale nodded once. "We believe she used that history to influence Riven," he said, "but the version she told him appears incomplete." Incomplete. The word felt too gentle for what the messages had revealed. Lies framed as truth, resentment fed slowly until loyalty turned into anger. I set the papers down carefully, my mind moving through the past with new clarity. Riven's sudden coldness, his insistence on fairness, his refusal to see Calder's actions as protective. It all looked different now. If Vera told him he had been wronged, then if she convinced him Calder had stolen something that rightfully belonged to him, then his anger had been built on a foundation that never existed. Calder had known the truth and chosen love anyway. That realization settled into me like a quiet ache. I stood and walked toward the window, watching the street below where nothing appeared different to the outside world. Cars passed, neighbors moved through their routines, unaware that the story of our family had just shifted beneath my feet. "He never told me," I said softly. Hale didn't answer immediately. "Some people carry certain truths alone," he said after a moment, "not out of secrecy, but protection." Protection. The word felt familiar now. The same instinct that made Calder transfer everything to me. The same instinct that kept him silent about the poisoned wine. I looked back at the sealed file resting on the table, the weight of it changing how I saw Riven's anger. It wasn't just grief or greed anymore. It was confusion shaped by lies, a resentment built on a story that had never been real. And as that truth settled in, something else became clear. The motive behind Riven's actions, the anger that once felt unexplainable, began to collapse under the weight of what Calder had carried alone all those years. The courtroom felt colder than I expected, not in temperature but in atmosphere. A quiet tension that settled over everyone long before the judge entered. I sat near the front, hands folded calmly in my lap, listening to the low murmur of voices echo against polished wood and high ceilings. Calder's name rested heavily in every document on the table before the prosecution, worn a reminder that this room wasn't about revenge. It was about truth finally being spoken out loud. Riven and Lyra sat at the defense table, their expressions carefully controlled. Riven's shoulders looked heavier than they had during the arrest, his gaze shifting occasionally toward the floor as if searching for something steady. Lyra remained composed, posture straight, hands resting lightly on the table, her calmness almost unsettling against the weight of the proceedings. When the prosecutor began, the room fell into complete silence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but measured, "today we present evidence that the events leading to Calder's death were not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate pattern. The first exhibit appeared on the screen, a photograph of the wine bottle Dr. Soren had tested. And I felt my chest tighten as the prosecutor explained how the substance found inside was capable of causing gradual illness. Dr. Soren's testimony followed, clear and precise. He described Calder arriving at his office quietly, asking for discretion, choosing not to accuse anyone directly, despite the risk he suspected. He feared escalation, Dr. Soren said calmly, but he wanted confirmation that something was wrong. The courtroom absorbed his words slowly, like a collective breath held too long. Next came the digital trail. A forensic analyst walked the court through messages recovered from Lyra's phone. Not dramatic threats, not open confessions, but patterns that spoke louder than any single sentence. Location pings placed her near the garage entrance during the birthday party. Deleted texts revealed coordination with Riven, made timing movements while guests were distracted. Screenshots appeared one after another, building a quiet but undeniable narrative. Lyra's expression shifted slightly when her messages were read aloud. Not panic, not anger, just a tightening around her eyes, the first crack in the composure she had maintained since the trial began. The prosecutor didn't rush. She let each piece settle before introducing the next. Security footage showing Riven moving toward Calder's car, mechanical reports detailing brake tampering, and finally the financial timeline that connected everything back to Calder's decision to transfer authority to me weeks earlier. I felt the weight of the room change as the story formed clearly in front of everyone. Not a sudden crime of passion, but a series of calculated steps driven by resentment and misinformation. Riven finally looked toward me, his expression uncertain. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the hesitation, the confusion, but it disappeared quickly as his attorney leaned closer, whispering something I couldn't hear. The defense argued restraint, misunderstanding, emotional strain. They spoke about family conflict, about grief, about misinterpretation of events, but the evidence sat quietly between those words, heavier than any explanation offered to soften it. When the judge called for a brief recess, the room stirred with whispered conversations. Reporters outside the courtroom shifted closer to the doors, waiting for updates that would carry our family's name into headlines. I didn't move. I watched the empty witness stand instead, thinking about Calder, the way he had chosen silence to protect people who were now forced to face the consequences of that silence. The judge returned, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the court. "Given the evidence presented," she said, "we will move forward to the sentencing phase pending final arguments." The words echoed through the room like a door closing behind us. Riven's shoulders stiffened. Lyra's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Their attorneys began gathering documents quickly, preparing for what came next. And as the judge outlined the schedule for sentencing discussions, I felt a quiet shift inside me. Not relief, not triumph, just the recognition that the story had moved beyond accusation. Because now the courtroom wasn't deciding whether something had happened. It was preparing to decide how long the consequences would last. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than the room itself, the kind of silence that settles between people who know something irreversible has already happened. I stood near the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the marble floor, when I heard footsteps slow behind me. Mara. Riven's voice sounded unfamiliar. Not cold like before, not defensive, just tired. I turned slowly, meeting his eyes without moving closer. An officer stood a few feet away, giving us space but not privacy. Lyra wasn't with him. For the first time since the trial began, Riven looked alone. He hesitated, searching my face as if trying to find the right version of me to speak to, the woman who once answered to Mom, or the one sitting silently through court proceedings. They told me, he said quietly, about Vera, about everything. I didn't respond immediately. The air between us carried too much history to rush into words. She lied, he added, his voice tightening. All those years. She said Dad stole from her, said he replaced her, erased her. She said you helped him keep me away from the truth. He swallowed hard, eyes dropping briefly to the floor. None of it was real, was it? I held his gaze gently but firmly. The answer didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be cruel. Silence did the work. Words couldn't. Riven let out a breath that sounded heavier than anger, more like something collapsing inside him. I thought I was fixing something, he continued, voice rougher now. I thought I was protecting what belonged to me. Every step felt justified because I believed her. The hallway echoed faintly with distant voices, but in that moment it felt like only the two of us existed. Years of affection, betrayal, confusion, and loss standing quietly between us. I should have asked him, he said, almost to himself. I should have asked Dad. The word Dad caught in the air, softer than anything he had said in months. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't remind him of the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, or the man who had stood in my living room demanding legal reversals. Instead, I stayed still, allowing him to hear the weight of his own words. Riven looked at me again, searching for anger, for blame, for something he could respond to. When he found only calm, his shoulders lowered slightly, and as if the absence of accusation unsettled him more than shouting ever could. I never meant, he began, then stopped, the rest of the sentence dissolving before it formed. Some apologies arrive too late to change anything. Some realizations don't undo what has already been set in motion. I saw that understanding begin to settle in him. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet and unavoidable. The officer shifted gently, signaling that time was almost up. Riven's voice dropped to a whisper. He chose me anyway, he said, even knowing the truth. And He didn't finish. I nodded once, not forgiveness, not condemnation, just acknowledgement. The silence between us carried more weight than any argument could have. He stepped back slowly, turning toward the courtroom doors as if walking into a future he could no longer rewrite. For a brief second, he paused, glancing over his shoulder like he wanted to say something else, but the words never came. When the doors closed behind him, the hallway felt larger again, emptier in a way that settled deep into my chest. I remained by the window, watching the fading light, knowing that the story had moved beyond explanations. Because whatever words Riven wished he could take back now, the decision was no longer ours to shape. Verdict day had finally arrived. The courtroom felt heavier than it had on any other day, the air thick with a quiet that pressed against every breath. People filled the seats behind me, reporters, neighbors, strangers who had followed the case from a distance, but their presence faded into the background as the judge entered. I kept my hands folded calmly in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my heartbeat against my palms. This wasn't a moment for anger or relief. It was simply the moment where choices became consequences. Riven stood at the defense table, shoulders squared but eyes lowered. The months since his arrest had changed him. The sharp certainty he once carried replaced by something quieter, heavier. Lyra stood beside him, composed as always, though the stillness in her posture felt more fragile now. The judge's voice carried evenly across the room. She began with the facts: the poisoned wine, the brake tampering, the coordinated actions revealed through digital records. Each detail felt clinical, stripped of emotion, as if the story of our family had been translated into language that belonged to law instead of memory. "For the charge of sabotage leading to death," she said, and her tone firm but measured, "Riven is sentenced to a term of imprisonment reflective of the severity of the offense." The number of years followed, spoken without hesitation. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I simply listened as the weight of time settled over him. Riven's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react otherwise. For a moment, he turned his head toward me, not seeking approval, not asking for forgiveness, just acknowledging that I was there to witness what had come from decisions neither of us could undo. The judge continued, shifting her attention toward Lyra. "For aiding and facilitating actions that contributed to the crime," she said, "Lyra will serve a lesser custodial sentence, reflecting her level of involvement." Lyra's composure held, though her fingers tightened briefly against the table. She nodded once, so accepting the words as if she had already rehearsed the outcome in her mind. Her attorney placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, guiding her through the procedural steps that followed. The courtroom murmured softly, the sound rising and falling like distant waves. Some faces showed sympathy, others quiet judgment. I remained still, neither celebrating nor grieving. The truth had already been spoken long before this day arrived. Detective Hale approached me quietly once the session ended. "Vera is still missing," he said in a low voice. "We've issued notices across several jurisdictions, but so far there's no confirmed location." I nodded slowly. Her absence felt less like mystery now and more like a shadow that refused to step into the light. The lies she planted had already taken root, and no arrest could erase that history. When outside the courthouse, reporters gathered behind barriers, voices rising as Riven and Lyra were escorted toward waiting vehicles. Cameras flashed briefly, capturing the end of a chapter none of us imagined would unfold this way. I watched from a distance, feeling the weight of finality settle quietly inside me. By the time I returned home, the afternoon light had softened, touching the edges of Calder's photographs with a gentle glow. A message from Halden waited on my phone. Short, precise. "The sentencing confirms activation of Calder's estate provisions. You now hold full operational control." I sat down slowly, the words echoing through me. Calder hadn't just prepared for loss. He'd structured everything so that this moment would arrive exactly as it did, not with chaos, but with clarity. The house felt different now. Not empty, not heavy, just still, like it was waiting for the next decision only I could make. The boardroom had always belonged to Calder. Even the chair at the head of the table seemed to carry his presence. The way he used to sit quietly before meetings began, listening more than he spoke. When I walked in that morning, the room fell silent, not out of resistance, but curiosity. People watched me carefully, waiting to see who I would become now that everything had shifted. Halden sat to my right, papers arranged neatly in front of him. Across the table, senior advisors and longtime partners avoided staring too long, though I could feel their attention measuring every step I took. Some of them had known me for years, only as Calder's wife, the one who attended events, smiled politely, and stayed out of operational decisions. Today was different. I didn't rush to sit. Instead, I walked slowly around the table, letting the quiet settle before taking the chair Calder once occupied. The leather felt cool beneath my hands. For a moment, memory pressed against me. His voice, his patience, the way he carried responsibility without needing applause. Then the moment passed, and I looked up at the room with calm certainty. "Thank you for coming," I said simply. Halden opened the meeting with formal statements confirming the transfer of authority. Legal language filled the space. voting rights reassigned, governance structures updated, oversight responsibilities now resting with me. The words sounded heavy, but they didn't intimidate me. Calder hadn't handed me chaos. He had handed me preparation. One advisor cleared his throat carefully. "We understand there may be changes," he said, choosing his words cautiously. "There will be," I replied, my tone even. I slid a document forward, a restructuring proposal drafted over the past week with Halden's help. New approval protocols, transparent oversight requirements, safeguards preventing any single family member from influencing operations without collective review. Every line designed quietly but firmly to close the gaps that had allowed betrayal to grow unnoticed. The room shifted as they read. No one argued. Some nodded slowly, recognizing the logic behind the changes. Others exchanged glances, surprised by the clarity of my decisions. I didn't raise my voice or justify myself. I simply explained the purpose. "This isn't about control," I said softly. "It's about stability." Calder had anticipated resistance, and his hidden clause made the transition smoother than anyone expected. Challenges that once might have delayed decisions now carried automatic restrictions, forcing cooperation without confrontation. The system worked exactly as he intended, not as punishment, but as protection. By the time the meeting ended, the tone in the room had changed. The curiosity that greeted me had softened into respect, quiet, cautious, but real. Outside, the afternoon air felt lighter. I paused at the building entrance, watching people move through their routines without knowing how much had changed inside those walls. For the first time since Calder's death, I felt something close to balance. Not triumph, not relief, just steady ground beneath my feet. Halden joined me briefly, holding a small folder. "There's one more matter," he said. "Your public statement. The media is already requesting confirmation of your new role." I nodded slowly. The thought of standing before cameras didn't frighten me, but it carried weight. The community that once saw me as a quiet figure beside Calder would soon see something different. A woman stepping fully into the space he left behind. Later that evening, I stood in front of the house where neighbors gathered quietly near their gates. Cameras waited at a respectful distance, microphones lowered but ready. I didn't speak loudly. I didn't offer dramatic promises. I simply confirmed that the company would move forward under my leadership, guided by the principles Calder built long before this moment arrived. As I finished, a ripple moved through the crowd. Not applause, not shock, but recognition. And the same people who once looked at me with sympathy now watched with a different kind of attention, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. And as the announcement spread beyond our street, beyond our city, I realized the shift wasn't just legal or financial. It was personal. The house felt different now. Not empty the way it did after the funeral, not heavy like the days that followed the arrests. It felt settled, as if the walls had finally stopped waiting for something to break. Morning light moved slowly across the living room floor, touching the edges of Calder's photographs, and I sat quietly with a cup of tea warming my hands. People expected me to celebrate. Messages arrived daily. Congratulations, admiration, questions about what I would do next with the empire now resting in my name. Some wanted a statement filled with strength and victory. Others wanted anger, a declaration that justice had been served loudly enough for everyone to hear. But Calder had never lived that way, and I wouldn't either. I walked into his study, the one room I had avoided changing since his death. Papers remained exactly where he left them, his favorite pen resting beside a notebook filled with half-finished thoughts. For weeks, I wondered why he never told me about the wine, the documents, the quiet steps he took to protect me. Now I understood, not as secrecy, but as instinct. He had carried danger quietly because he believed my peace mattered more than his fear. The The truth about Riven's past sat folded inside a drawer nearby, sealed again after the investigation. I could have used it to humiliate him publicly, and to rewrite the story in a way that made me look stronger and him smaller. The world loves spectacle. But that wasn't the legacy Calder built, and it wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I chose silence instead. Not the silence of weakness, but the silence of dignity. Outside, neighbors passed slowly along the sidewalk, offering soft waves instead of curious stares. The community had shifted too. Where there was once gossip, there was now a quiet respect that didn't need to be spoken out loud. They saw the company moving forward, saw the stability returning, and understood that the ending of this story wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. I stepped into the garden where Calder used to stand every evening, hands in his pockets, watching the sky change color. The air carried a faint scent of jasmine, and for the first time since everything happened, I allowed myself to feel something lighter than grief. Not happiness exactly, but calm. He had known something was coming long before I did. He saw the fractures in our family, the danger hidden beneath familiar faces, and he prepared quietly without asking for recognition. The transfer, the documents, the hidden clause, none of it was about wealth alone. It was about making sure I could stand when the ground beneath us shifted. My phone buzzed softly with another message from Halden, confirming the final closure of legal proceedings. The empire was fully mine now, every structure aligned with the vision Calder trusted me to carry forward. I set the phone aside without opening it immediately. For once, urgency didn't drive my decisions, and I sat on the bench beneath the tree Calder planted years ago, letting the silence wrap around me like something familiar. The past no longer felt like a wound I needed to defend. It felt like a story completed. Painful, yes, but honest. I thought about Riven's last words in the hallway, about the way realization softened his voice when he finally understood the lies that shaped his anger. I didn't hold on to resentment. Carrying that weight would only tie me to the past longer than necessary. Calder's strength had always been quiet, the kind that didn't need to win loudly to be real. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, I stood slowly and looked back toward the house. It wasn't just a place of memories anymore. It was a place of decisions. Mine to make, mine to carry. People would remember the headlines, the courtroom, the numbers attached to Calder's name. But I would remember the whisper on my birthday, the way his voice carried urgency and care at the same time, the way he trusted me with something deeper than wealth. Because in the end, he didn't leave me money. He left me truth, and the courage to carry it without fear.